The tourist thought his money gave him the right to do anything. He splashed the royal guard with water as if it were just a funny joke, but the response he got was so unexpected that the entire crowd froze. What happened next shocked even the most indifferent onlookers. London. Morning. Exactly like one of those tourist ads, only without the background music and with the ominous sound of children's screams chopped up in cell phone videos. Crowds of tourists, slowly but surely, fill the square near Buckingham Palace, their laughter and loud chatter drowning out the grandeur of British history, hidden behind tall gates. Just another day, nothing new, but there's one detail no one notices. Among all these people, there's one invisible yet very real figure, a soldier standing on his post. Sturdy, silent, like a 1,000-year-old rock, he is the living embodiment of British discipline and tradition. And this is where our story begins. Meet Gary. Gary is your typical tourist, the kind who seems to think the entire world revolves around his massive luggage. Judging by his expression, he's used to attention. He's in London to see some cultural stuff, and of course, he's looking for adventure. Because if you're a tourist and you're spending money, you can do anything. What could be more cool and fun than poking fun at one of the greatest symbols of the British monarchy? Gary walked up to the guard, looked at his impassive face, and immediately decided to perform his first act in this little show. Grabbing a bottle of water from his backpack, he did what, in his mind, was the ultimate prank. Splashing the water right on the guard's uniform, he grinned, eagerly awaiting a reaction. What was he expecting? Laughter? Anger? A whole world turned upside down? He probably thought that just like that, this man, or rather this statue in Gary's eyes, would suddenly start hopping, running, and pulling faces. But that didn't happen. The guard stood, as he always did, motionless, like he was cemented into the ground. The water rolled down his hat and uniform, but it had no effect on him. He kept staring into the distance, not changing the position of his head or his expression. Someone in the crowd coughed. Someone shouted something like, "Hey man, smile!" as if that were the only acceptable response to such a performance. Well, of course, who wouldn't laugh seeing the British Guard turned into a circus show, right? After all, traditions, honor, and discipline, things that have lasted for over 300 years, are clearly no match for a simple, funny Instagram picture. But here's the interesting part. What was happening around wasn't actually so funny to everyone. Gary had no idea that, in reality, it wasn't the guard, but his own actions that were turning this moment into a farce. Have you ever thought about what happens when you break rules that were made not yesterday, but centuries ago? Because he was sure that, as a paying tourist, he could do whatever he wanted, but someone in the crowd had already started to freeze, and those looks too loud to ignore. The crowd split. Some kept laughing and filming, others, quietly grinding their teeth, were noticeably uncomfortable, and some even began to quietly comment, "How could he even do that?" Still, Gary was sure the fun was just getting started. He stepped even closer, now intent not just on insulting the guard, but on really provoking him. After all, to him, the guard was nothing more than part of the decor. He moved closer and, with a self-satisfied grin, added, "Hey, do you even like this job? You're standing there like a wooden puppet, and you won't even move. Smile, at least. A couple of minutes of life for you would make my day." Well, who does that? This is beyond ridiculous. This guy seriously thinks he can insult someone just for standing at his post doing his job? No thought, no respect. Everything is reduced to the fact that he paid money, so he must be entitled to entertainment. What an absurdity. Once again, the guard didn't move an inch. His face was just as motionless as it had been hours earlier when he first took his post. But here's the important part. His silence wasn't weakness. It was a test, and it was clear that the more Gary tried to provoke him, the more the guard demonstrated his strength of restraint and dignity. Hey, this is not a theater, the guard thought, not budging, like an invisible wall between him and the world. And you are not the audience. But Gary clearly didn't get it. The more his actions became audacious, the clearer the contrast became. He didn't understand that this wasn't a circus, and no one was obliged to amuse him for money. Let's be honest. If anyone else had felt the weight of the situation, they might have been ashamed. But Gary kept joking and taunting, oblivious to the fact that those few people who weren't supporting him were starting to look at him with disapproval. Gary quote, smug grin hadn't faded. If anything, it had only grown wider. His performance was clearly becoming a success in his eyes, as he saw his friends filming the whole thing with their phones, giggling like children who just witnessed a circus clown drop his pants. Of course, they weren't seeing what the rest of the crowd was seeing, the discomfort, the tension building between them and the immovable figure in front of them. No, Gary wasn't having any of it. In his mind, this was his moment, his time to shine. After all, he was the tourist. He had every right to do whatever he wanted. Paying to see the Queen's Guard was, in his world, like paying to see a rock band perform. And what do people do when they see a rock band? They yell, they scream, they want more. They expect to be entertained. This was no different. The soldier was there to amuse him, clearly. But did anyone else feel the weight of what was happening? Did anyone else see how absurd this was? Seriously, who even thinks like that? Who sees an official guard standing in front of one of the world's most iconic palaces and thinks, this is my personal entertainment show? Let me guess, it's someone who thinks that because he's holding a ticket, he owns the place. And apparently, everyone else who's standing there does too. Who's with me? That's a low bar even for a tourist. Gary wasn't satisfied with just the water. Oh no, he had bigger plans. He took a step forward, looked directly at the guard, and put on his most exaggerated, obnoxious voice as though he were speaking to a child. Hey mister, you're supposed to be the highlight of London. Is this all you've got? Just stand there like a mannequin? Look, I can do it too. And with that, Gary began mimicking the soldier's posture, mocking it with exaggerated movements, jerking his arms at odd angles, even sticking his chest out like he was some sort of parade float. You know that feeling when someone is trying so hard to be funny, but all you can feel is secondhand embarrassment? Yeah, that was the crowd now. There were a few people chuckling, probably the kind who would have laughed at a dog in a sweater, but the rest were starting to shift uncomfortably on their feet. The sound of clicking phones filled the air as Gary preened in front of the soldier, showing off for the tiny audience that still found it amusing. But then, something unexpected happened. One woman, a little older, clearly tired of the charade, turned to her husband and muttered loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "This is disgusting. He's mocking someone who's serving his country." It wasn't much, but the words hit the crowd like a wave. Some of the younger tourists laughed it off, trying to brush it aside with a, "oh, it's just harmless fun" attitude, but there was a shift, a discomfort in the air. A few people even shot Gary a glance that made him pause just for a second. But Gary wasn't about to stop. He was on a roll now, and in his mind, the more he mocked, the more he owned the situation. It was his world, and everyone else was just living in it. With a dramatic flourish, he took his phone out, pointing it right at the soldier's face for the perfect shot. "Smile, mate, you're on camera." And that's when things took a turn for the worse, not for the guard, but for Gary. As he stepped forward to get that perfect close-up shot, he crossed an invisible line. The white line painted on the ground, just a foot away from the guard's position, was there for a reason: to protect the dignity of both the soldier and the public. You don't invade that space. Ever. But Gary, of course, didn't care about rules. He was the tourist. Rules didn't apply to him. Suddenly, the horse that stood next to the guard shifted, and with an audible snort, it lurched forward. Gary froze, panic flashing across his face for just a moment. The horse wasn't happy. In fact, it seemed irritated, perhaps by the constant attention it was getting, or perhaps by the clear disrespect from the human in front of it. For a split second, the world seemed to hold its breath. The horse was massive, its hooves scraping the stone underfoot. The soldier remained as still as ever, his posture as unwavering as the Queen's palace itself. But that wasn't the only thing that didn't budge. Gary stood there like an idiot, completely unprepared for the next move, and the moment was palpable. People could feel it. This was the moment where it was no longer funny. Gary had gotten too close, and now he wasn't just messing with a soldier. He was provoking a powerful animal who, let's face it, didn't need much of an excuse to get upset. And the next thing you know, the horse gave a loud, startled neigh and lunged forward, causing Gary to trip backward, landing flat on his backside with an ungainly thud. The crowd gasped. Seriously, who could have predicted that one? Well, maybe you could have, I mean, come on, there's a reason they don't let tourists stand inches away from the animals, right? But Gary was too busy playing the role of tourist who knows everything, and it all went so beautifully wrong. The crowd went silent for a split second. And then, a ripple of laughter broke out. Not the kind of laughter Gary was expecting, though. No, this was the other kind. The kind that comes when you realize someone's about to get a lesson they'll never forget. The kind of laugh that says, "You had it coming." Gary scrambled up from the pavement, now fully embarrassed, dusting himself off. But instead of retreating, his eyes narrowed in frustration. "What the hell is your problem?" he spat at the guard. But it was no longer just about the guard. It was about everyone watching, and the crowd had definitely made their choice. The laughs grew louder, and slowly, the murmurs of condemnation started to overshadow the cheering tourists. You know what's funny about this situation? People didn't laugh at Gary out of kindness. They laughed because, deep down, they knew that, in the end, there was only one person in that scene who deserved to stand tall. And that person wasn't the one acting like a clown. That horse, probably more dignified than Gary in that moment.